hydrogen space and into the EV space. And so Zayn, take us away.
We're taking the Shell team across all of the verticals today. So that's really exciting. Hey, Shell, I'm Zayn, and I'm joined here by Anush and Pavan, also on my team, and Dave, our last teammate. He couldn't make it today, but during the Pi Challenge, we focused on electric vehicle charging. And on your website, it says that Shell plans to operate 500,000 of these charging stations by 2025. And based on some available data from 2019, we saw that Shell has 90,000 charging stations as of current day. And we're actually assuming that you have 200,000. So 900,000 or 90,000 in 2019, and now you have 200,000 stations planned. But after talking to multiple experts in the EV industry, and then looking at what the unit economics of this are, the number of stations left to plant multiplied by the cost to plant these stations, Shell needs to spend $12 to $25 billion in initial capex to hit the 500,000 goal. And the EV market is one that's emerging. It's really high growth, and it rewards players that are capital efficient and light. So our group started hypothesizing around ways that Shell could achieve this objective, and we landed on a franchise business model where Shell offloads the capex cost to prospective franchisees, reducing the initial investment from Shell's side for capex, and in exchange, Shell takes care of the operating expenses and manages the business for them. Then franchisees pay Shell through an EV charging as a subscription service, which gives Shell an 83% net margin while building on Shell's current assets. And after talking to different individuals in Los Angeles and around California, which is our pilot location, happy to talk more about California later, there's a really high demand for planting some of these EV stations. But these prospective franchisees, they have three main pain points: maintenance, downtime, and logistics. Particularly, they're worried about losing $35,000 in revenue from downtime. And we arrived at that number based on an economic model we created that assumed a franchisee has 3 ports, they're all charging for 5 hours, and one of them is down. And that 35,000, that's 31% of a franchise revenue in 1 year. So in order for Shell to scale to 500,000 chargers, we're recommending that Shell looks into creating a product that appeals to franchisees and eliminates those pain points. And there are 2 pillars to that service. Pillar 1 addresses maintenance and downtime through remote monitoring, where we can enable some communication between the hardware, the physical EV charging stations, and then the software. And Pillar 2 targets logistics and the growth pain point. These site hosts have a demand for planting these stations. And so seeing that, our goal is to create a bundle, which I'll be calling Aftercare for this presentation. And this bundle pulls them to open stations under Shell Recharge Solutions versus planting a station on their own. So I want to talk a bit more about this maintenance services and remote monitoring, but I want to go through what the current state of it is, because I think it's important to understand the root cause. And we got this process after we talked to the ex-CTO of Greenlots, and he just walked us through what the status quo is. And so the first step is a station goes down. These site hosts don't know that the station is down, neither do the consumers. The consumers need to get to the station, plug the charger into their car, and then realize because of the dashboard on their car that this charger doesn't work. They'll then report the error to the company. Then that company will send a technician to commute on site, and that costs $800 just to send the technician on site. That's not including the labor cost. And while they're on site, they'll diagnose the error and then order the parts. Those parts will take 6 weeks to arrive. And then the fourth step is this technician commutes back to the station where they spend around 7 hours fixing this error. And in this process, it takes cumulatively 6 weeks, and this costs $35,000 for the franchisees. That's where I got the initial number from the overall downtime that I mentioned earlier. So then we asked our mate, okay, well, what's the future state? Or based on what we have at the time, can you validate that this future state works? And it's a future state that includes remote monitoring, which is the hardware communicating with the software through the cloud and letting site hosts and consumers know that when an error has occurred, who are the stakeholders that you need to be talking to? And then after that error occurs, what issues should you be notifying each stakeholder of? So once there's an error, we communicate that with the stakeholder. We send out a notification to the operators, the site hosts, any of the franchisees, all of the consumers. And then the technician is sent a message to schedule an appointment and order the parts. And then after that appointment is set and the parts are arrived, they'll go into the station to then fix the error. And now this last sequence of 3 steps are really important, because this is where Shell starts to get some really interesting effects. And while this technician is on site, he'll log the error into some common format that's standardized across the network. And we can take those errors that are standardized across this network, and he can classify them into common system faults. So once we have these common system faults, we can then run algorithms on them. So if one of these errors occurs, we can now solve it remotely without needing to deploy a technician. And eventually, we think we'll be able to get to 80% of hardware or software issues solved remotely because of this data. And we got that 80% number from a Ford case study. And this 80% allows us to then deploy fixes across the network. So everything I have in yellow here is part of the future state. The only point that's part of the current state, which is mandatory for this solution, is to have the technician commute on site if part of that 20% can't be solved remotely. But I want to double click on one piece of this, which is just deploying fixes across the network. How do we do this autonomously? What's the package? And this is really what attracts franchisees, because as technicians log more errors into the common format that I mentioned earlier, aftercare gets better because now there's more data and these models continue to improve with more users. And with that improvement, we can solve more errors remotely at a low cost for franchisees. And this low cost gives them more revenue because now revenue isn't being lost in the downtime. They're making revenue because these chargers have higher uptime. And this high revenue, low downtime cost is what attracts more franchisees. And it just keeps this wheel running and running and running. So the main point is all of this data really improves downtime because these algorithms can now run these autonomous and remote fixes. If a problem occurs, then run X algorithm to fix it. That's all done through the software. And we can send both software and hardware updates for any of those errors. And this attracts more franchisees because we know that downtime and maintenance is a major pain point. So if we can solve it with the aftercare maintenance services plan, then there'll be more pulled to come to Shell, which is ultimately the end goal of scaling. Now I want to transition into talking about the growth services. And this addresses the logistics pain point that I mentioned earlier. So 6 out of 7 site hosts that we talked to said that they wanted less involvement on some of the tasks like KPI monitoring. And so to provide this, we have a 5 key step process here. And the first one is just we want to send out auto quarterly reports to the franchisees, which detail the site's progress. Second is we want to have office hours open for any operational questions they have. These consultants will be open during business hours. Then the third piece is you can compare stations with others. So geographically, if there's a station that's 5 miles away and they're making more money because they have some new chips or they have maybe they're geographically positioned to be better, we can now look at all of the key features of that station, whether it be the grocery store or the way that the station is set up, where it is geographically, and now we can compare where you can get the most revenue. And there are 2 more offerings that we're really differentiated from any of the other case studies we looked at. And those 2 are, the first one is setting prices with machine learning. And we talked to Guthrie, who's a manager at Tesla, and he's on their powertrain engineering team. And he mentioned that price setting is really a key advantage for electric vehicles. And Airbnb was the case study that I just want to use to explain what this is. So if I'm a host at Airbnb, you have 2 options. I have 2 options as a host. I can give up pricing power to Airbnb. And when I give up pricing power, Airbnb uses their aggregated data on the supply of houses, the demand of houses, the geographic location, seasonal adjusted data. They can use all of this data to then set the best price, or I can set my own price and that stays static. And it's very similar for these EV stations. I can give up power to Shell to run these algorithms on finding the best prices on the best times, and I can attract more EV riders, or I can set it myself. And we think that the former is what's more suitable, and that's one of the reasons why it's part of this growth services package. And then the last piece of growth services is carbon credits, which provide a 42% increase for Shell only if they implement these. So when we first heard about carbon credits, we were really skeptical because it's policy dependent, it's somewhat frothy, and it's highly risky because of its potential to disappear quickly. But when we talked to the VP of technology at EV Connect, which is a full stack EV startup, he mentioned that most of their revenue actually comes from carbon credits right now. And in our pilot location, California, these are being rewarded to companies at scale. So now our question was, why aren't more site hosts? Why aren't more individuals using these? And the sole way to benefit from these are being a registered market participant, something that requires tons of legal work, tons of payment, and that's not as appealing to these franchisees. But Shell has the #2 trading desk in the world and is a participant in this market already. So entering carbon credits in California would help Shell gain 40% total revenue and then 60% for franchisees. And we think that this carbon credit strategy adds another positive pull to the bundle to help attract more of these franchisees. So after 6 weeks of research and validation, we think that this solution is built for a super major, but it operates like a SaaS startup. So it's really easily scalable. There's a low upfront cost of $36 million. This is the cost of business operations, the technicians, and their labor. And there's a net margin of 83%, as I mentioned, through the EV charging as a business subscription model. It's really built on top of all of the strengths that Shell currently has. So it's just a fusion of different departments, the franchisees and the gas stations. Then we're taking the team that you already have on EVs, and then we're taking the team from the energy trading desk, and we're pulling these together to now create a compelling EV strategy for Shell. The third is demand globally is rising. And in our pilot location, what we're really excited about is demand. It has a CAGR right now of 15.44%. And Pavan, Anush, and I, we saw the latest acquisition that Shell just made of BYD, which is really exciting to start to expand more charging stations to China and Europe, 2 locations that we included on our original recommendation deck. And I know the CFO, Jessica, also mentioned in the Q4 2021 call that China is one of the locations that you're looking to expand into. The fourth is just multiple revenue streams, the franchisee model, the royalties from the franchisees, the carbon credits, and then the aftercare subscription, licensing as well. The fifth is these data flywheels, which essentially just have some software network effects. So the more people that are brought in, then the more data you can collect. And then with that more data, we can now make the downtime uncertainty and less, and then just de-risk this option for franchisees. And then the last piece, and I think one of the key ones that we wanted to talk about was just, we can help you reach net zero. And we're assuming based on this and some more calculations, which we can talk about, 150.6 million reduction in scope 1 through 3 emissions, which is 11.3%. And we think that we can 3x that by 2050. So Pavan, Anush, and I were really, really excited, as well as Dave, about this space. And we enjoyed working on this problem for 6 weeks and just hypothesizing on what a future EV strategy for Shell might look like. So if you know anyone that sits close to these problems, we have some potential names on our side that we would love to give you. Or if you're interested in talking to us more, here's my email. Pavan, Anush, and I would love to chat. And I mentioned a ton of numbers. I mentioned California as a pilot. So would just love the opportunity to share some more of these numbers after if you're interested. So this is our global SAM model. This is our global TAM model. And then we do have some information here on the pilot as well that I'd be happy to go over in Q&A. But thanks so much, Shell. We really appreciated it.
Thank you so much, team. Quite an interesting walkthrough. Pretty sure judges feel the same. Who wants to start this time around? Freddie, Karina, Hila, Alex, anyone?
I was writing down questions, Zayn, and as you went along, and then you proceeded to answer each one of them as you were continued on through your presentation. So what I will say, one thing I loved about it is that one of the value propositions for Shell as a company is our integrated footprint, right? Other majors do not have that, but we have, starting up at the upstream to the midstream to the downstream to the trading. We are one of the few companies that covers that whole spectrum. And you nailed on so many of those strengths that Shell has in taking advantage of that integrated value chain. So I love that because again, it taps into a strength that we have that gives us a competitive advantage and doing it in an energy transition space. So kudos on the delivery, the content. You covered a lot of bases. Like I said, you were, it's clear that you have thought this through, not just at the initial level, but all the way through. So bravo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Akila. Yes, quite insightful for the team. Freddie, you want to go next?
Next, guys, really good. What I loved so much about this one, again, was you've got such a deep understanding of really important digital forces and digital business model concepts, which is so often missing from our industry. So you've thought through network effects, you've thought through how you create a data flywheel, right, to enhance value over time. You've thought about scale, which all of these forces underpin, right? You've thought about creating an ecosystem model. I love the ideas that you had around creating customer value props for the franchises. That was just great. I love the aftercare service model too. And I think that as a business model innovation concept, this one's got serious legs. It was really creative and original. So I thought that was really strong. For me, some things that could have been worked on in the pack was just some clarity on the economics, right? Exactly what is the uplift here for us? Maybe you alluded to those revenue streams, right? Just breaking them down a bit more because there's tons of detail there. It's obviously you guys have done a load of thinking, but coming at it cold, I was a bit like, whoa, tidal wave of information. So, but I, what I did pick up, I loved, and I just want to say that was really creative, really inspirational presentation. So well done.
Great. Before the next question, is it okay if I just share my screen and Pavan's on the call? He was the primary on the economic model. So we can just walk through some of those numbers, and I think it might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Wait, that's actually one thing I wanted to address because I don't know if one of you guys are going to ask this question, but one thing I'd ask off the bat is like, okay, this seems great for Shell, but do franchisees actually want to pay this? Like, do franchisees actually want? Like, is this economically incentivized for franchisees, right? And that's a core question because you can't get franchisees onboarded if it's not economically incentivized for them. So we spent a lot of time thinking about that, and after incorporating these are very like conservative assumptions that we walk through with actually the ex-head of product for e-mobility at Shell. He said that this actually kind of makes sense, which surprised us initially. And the main takeaway from this analysis that we did is that the carbon credits actually, especially in our pilot location of California, provide some significant runway of revenue for our franchisees. Because beforehand, if Shell basically acts as a funnel that collects carbon credits across their whole network, which you can do if you write it into the franchise agreement, then you can give back 40% of that value back to franchisees. And that's just pure unlocked revenue that they didn't tap into before. And the other thing I'd highlight is that there's no cost that they're incurring from downtime here because through Aftercare's like network-wide presence, we can have like technicians deployed at strategic locations to achieve like unparalleled uptime across the SRS network, the Shell Recharge Solutions network, right? Whereas if you're an independent site host, you have to call up your technician. You need to have your buddy like on the other side, right? It's just a different relationship. So what that kind of comes down to is like you get around a 5-year break even instead of the industry standard of 7-year break even when operating 3 L3 chargers. But this is again in America where we could be naive with this is assuming that you can just scale this to other parts, especially where the policy is different with regards to carbon credits and everything, right? Yeah, that's what I want to touch on. I just didn't want to come off as like we didn't think about the franchisees at all because we understand that's like a crucial part of this whole thing working, right?
Great,
Just,
thanks, Pavan.
I was just going to say a quick response to that in terms of the franchisees. Our dealer structure is different in different countries, so that would actually be good to think about the best place for a pilot. California, I think, is ideal for the US. What you'll find in places in Europe is it reflects the model, or California reflects the model that you're seeing in Europe. So that could be a good determinant for pilot location. The other piece in terms of, you mentioned bolstering the reliability of the networks, that would make it attractive to our dealers as well, because it's a chicken or the egg thing in some cases, right? They don't want to move to EV charging stations if it means they lose revenue on gas or petrol today, right? And so if you can demonstrate all the proof points as to how they financially benefit from this, then the dealers will be more incentivized to make that switch over to EVs, knowing that there's a reliability and there's an economic advantage.
Agreed.
Thank you, Akila. Karina, you want to add your thoughts?
Sure. So, guys, again, well done, right? I'm not an expert on the EV charging network and how that even works in Shell at all, but I really liked the angle of where, with the collection of data and the diagnosis of the problems, that likely a lot of these problems can also be resolved remotely, right? Because pretty much that's what Tesla does as well, right? And pretty much with the power of data, the product kind of like grows with you, and I liked that. The other thing I really liked was in terms of the lead time to turning on the solution, and in terms of the identification of the opportunity based on the parts in place today. it's like literally, if we are serious about this, it's something we can start in the next 3 months, right? So I was really excited about that part as well. Of course, thinking of digital technologies, of course, the mind also does go to, in terms of the logistics or the supply chain of solving the problems, the 3D printing come into play. Of course, we typically think to use 3D printing because we are working in the heavy industry with very expensive equipment. But that's where in the whole EV charging space and where the terminals like the Tesla ones are rather small. I don't know exactly how expensive these are and if at all 3D printing would play a role, but it's just something that came to mind. And but like love it, right? And that 6 weeks, you could think this wide and this deep and connect all these dots. Like I was like, how brilliant is this, right? Mind blown.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much.
On top of going to school and leading a teenage life, like wow, amazing.
All right, good job, team.